The station was called the Conclave. It floated in open space, far from any single planet, far from any single empire. It was built so that every species could meet in one place and talk instead of fight. The walls were tall. The halls were wide. The air was mixed to suit 100 different kinds of lungs. And the noise, never stopped. There were clicking languages, humming languages, languages that moved through vibration in the floor. Ships docked and undocked every few hours. Flags and banners hung from the ceiling, each one belonging to a different civilization. Humanity's banner was small. It hung near the back. Humans had only been allowed into the conclave 2 years ago. They were listed in the official galactic record as a Tier F species. That was the lowest possible rank. It meant they were considered primitive, undeveloped, not a threat, not important. Most of the older species didn't even bother learning the name of the human delegation. They were just there, like background noise. Easy to ignore. Ethan Voss was part of that delegation. He was not tall. He was not large. He had short dark hair, a plain face, and eyes that were a shade of gray that most humans would have called unremarkable. He wore the standard diplomatic uniform, clean, pressed, simple. He carried no weapon. He had no title beyond delegate. He stood at the back of the human group, near the entrance hall of the conclave, holding a small data tablet, reading quietly while the chaos of the station moved around him. He looked like nobody special. That was not entirely wrong. Ethan Voss had not been chosen because he was exceptional. He had been chosen because he was experienced. He had been a soldier once, on the outer colonies, where humanity's early expansion into space had not been peaceful. He had seen difficult things. He had survived difficult things. Now he worked in diplomacy, which he said was mostly the same job but with more talking and less bleeding. His supervisor had described him as reliable and hard to rattle. That was considered high praise. He was reading his data tablet when the Dravathi arrived. Everyone noticed. The Dravathi were hard to miss. They were tall. The shortest among them stood nearly 2 meters. Their skin was a deep dark gray, almost like polished stone. Their eyes were large and bright, a sharp amber color that caught the light strangely. They walked in a formation, with warriors on the outside, and the royal party at the center. Their armor was ceremonial but real. It had been worn in actual battles and showed it. At the center of the group walked Emperor Dravath Kale, a massive figure with a broad chest and a face that looked like it had been carved rather than born. He did not look at the other species as he walked. He looked forward, and the crowd simply moved. Behind him walked his daughter. Princess Velshara of the Dravathi Empire was younger than her father, but carried herself the same way, as if the floor existed only because she allowed it to. She wore robes of deep crimson that moved like liquid when she walked. Her hair was pulled back tight and woven with thin threads of silver metal. Her face was sharp and still. She was, by any standard in the galaxy, someone who had never been told no and had never needed to ask twice. She walked into the entrance hall and looked around the way someone looks at a room they have already bought. Then something made her stop. Not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling that wasn't quite right. She scanned the room slowly. The other delegations had reacted to the Dravathi arrival the way most species always did. They had shifted back, not running, nothing so obvious, just the small automatic movement of creatures who sensed something larger than them nearby. The Dravathi emitted something, a low biological signal their bodies produced without thinking. It was not sound and not light. It was closer to pressure, like the feeling before a storm. Most species felt it without knowing they felt it. Their bodies simply responded. Step back. Lower your eyes. Give space. Every group in the hall had done this. Except one. Velshara's eyes moved to the human delegation. They were a small group near the far wall. Some of them had also shifted slightly, but one of them had not moved at all. He stood with a data tablet in his hand, reading, as if nothing had entered the room. His posture had not changed. His shoulders had not dropped. He had not looked up. She stared at him for a moment. He was reading. She decided it meant nothing. He probably hadn't noticed their arrival. Humans were not known for awareness. The formal welcome ceremony began. Each delegation was introduced in order of rank. The Dravathi were announced second, after the Keth Empire, which held the top position in the conclave for the 3rd century in a row. When humanity was announced, the name barely carried across the hall before the next name was already being spoken. A few species near the human group glanced over briefly, and then looked away. Ethan did not seem to care. He tucked his tablet away and watched the proceedings with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. An hour into the first open session, a small incident happened. It was the kind of thing that happened often at the conclave. Tensions were always just below the surface. Lord Veth, a junior noble in the Dravathi retinue, moved through the side corridor behind the main hall. He was large, even for a Dravathi, and he moved as if space owed him a debt. A young human aide named Soren was coming the other direction, carrying a stack of data files. Veth did not slow down. Soren did not have time to move. Veth walked into him, or through him, depending on how you saw it. The files scattered. Soren hit the wall hard and went down to one knee. Veth kept walking. Several people saw it. No one said anything, except Ethan, who had been in that corridor. He crossed the space between them quickly and crouched beside Soren. He helped him up, checked that he was not badly hurt, handed him 2 of the files from the floor. Then he stood and looked at Lord Veth, who had stopped and turned around with an expression that expected entertainment. Ethan's voice was calm and even. Not raised. Not shaking. That contact will be recorded as an act of physical aggression under Article 7 of the Conclave Charter, he said. Delegate Soren is a protected diplomatic personnel. I'll need your full designation for the report. Veth stared at him. Then he let out a short sound that was the Dravathi equivalent of a laugh, deep, dismissive, contemptuous. He said nothing. He turned and walked away. Ethan watched him go. His face did not change. He pulled out his tablet and began typing the report. Across the hall, Velshara had seen the whole thing from the balcony above. She had expected the human to flinch, to look away, to do what every small species did when a Dravathi noble dismissed them, absorb it, look at the floor, pretend it did not happen. He had not flinched. He had not raised his voice. He had not backed down. He had simply stated a fact, been ignored, and then gone back to work, as if being ignored was not a problem he had any interest in. She watched him walk back down the corridor. The feeling from before came back. Quiet. Unnamed. She pressed it down and turned away. But she did not forget it. The negotiation chamber was a large room with curved walls and long tables that bent in a half circle. Each delegation had its own section. The air was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, the kind of quiet that meant everyone was being careful with their words. The session had been going on for 3 hours, and nothing important had been decided, which was normal. Important decisions at the conclave almost never happened on the first day. The first day was for watching each other, for measuring, for deciding who was worth taking seriously. Lord Veth sat behind the Dravathi section, saying little, watching more. He had a habit of picking things apart with his eyes, looking for weakness, the way a predator looks for a limp in the herd. Ethan sat at the far end of the human section with 2 other delegates. He had been mostly quiet. He had spoken once, briefly, to raise a point about resource corridor rights near the edge of human explored space. No one had responded with any real attention. He had noted that down in his tablet and moved on. The session was winding toward its close when the door at the back of the chamber opened. It was not supposed to open, not during session. The guards outside were there specifically to prevent interruptions. So when the door opened, every head in the room turned. What happened next was fast. The figure that entered was not a guard. It wore a neutral service uniform, the kind worn by station maintenance workers. But the body beneath it moved wrong, too controlled, too focused. One hand was already reaching under the uniform as the figure crossed the room in long, straight strides, heading directly toward the center of the Dravathi section, toward Emperor Kale. Several things happened at once. Kale's personal guard started to rise from their seats. 3 other delegations began to scatter from their tables. A weapon came out compact, short range, designed for exactly this kind of enclosed space. Ethan was already moving. He had not waited to confirm what he was seeing. Some part of his mind, the part built by years in places where waiting 1 second too long meant not coming back, had already finished the calculation. He did not run. Running was loud and slow. He moved at an angle, cutting across the open floor, and he did not head toward the shooter. He headed toward the trajectory line, the space between the weapon and the target. The shooter was 6 meters away when Ethan reached the line. The first guard finally reached the shooter at almost the same moment, but Ethan had already made contact. His left hand caught the shooter's weapon arm at the wrist, not grabbing, but redirecting, twisting with his body weight behind it. The shot fired. It went wide, into the upper wall. The sound was sharp and short and left a ringing silence behind it. What followed was not elegant. The shooter was larger than Ethan, stronger, and trained. Ethan knew this in the first half-second. He did not try to win by force. He took 2 hits, one to the ribs, one across the jaw, and he used both of them. The first impact let him change his grip. The second told him exactly how the shooter was positioned. He stepped into the second blow, instead of away from it, which brought him inside the shooter's reach, too close for the weapon to be useful. And with his elbow already moving toward the shooter's weapon hand, he heard something crack. The weapon dropped. The shooter pulled back to strike again. Ethan held up his free hand open, palm forward, and said one word. Stop. Not a command. Not a shout. A statement. Quiet and certain. The way someone speaks when they are not afraid of the answer. The shooter froze. It lasted only a second. But in that second, the station guards poured through the door and it was over. The shooter went to the floor under 4 bodies and did not resist anymore. Ethan stood where he was, breathing slowly, and let his hands drop to his sides. The chamber was completely still. Every delegate in the room was staring at him. The Dravathi guards, the ones who had been rising from their seats when all of this began, were standing frozen in their half-risen positions, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who could not explain what they had just witnessed. They were trained warriors. They had protocols. They had reacted. They had reacted 2 full seconds after Ethan had already finished. Emperor Kale had not moved at all. He sat with his hands on the table, looking at the spot where the shooter had stood, and then slowly turned his eyes to Ethan. He said nothing. Velshara had been standing near the side wall. She was not shaking. She was Dravathi, and Dravathi did not shake. But there was something in her chest that was moving without her permission, a cold and rapid thing she had not felt in years. She realized, after a moment, that it was not fear. It was the absence of understanding. She had watched the entire thing. She had seen every step, every decision, and she still could not fully explain it. The human had not been the biggest person in the room. He had not been armed. He had not had the authority to act. He had simply acted, as if the size of the problem and the size of his own resources were completely unrelated factors. Later, after the room had been cleared and the guards had taken the shooter away, Velshara went looking. She found him in the station's medical bay. He was sitting on a bench near the back. He had taken off his jacket and was wrapping his own hand with a medical strip. Slowly, carefully, his face was calm. She came closer and saw that 2 of the fingers on his left hand were bent at wrong angles, broken. She stopped. He noticed her. He did not seem surprised. "You did not call the medic," she said. "There were people more hurt than me," he said. "I was fine waiting." She looked at the fingers. "That looks like it hurts." "It does," he said. Simple. Without drama. She waited for more. There was no more. He went back to wrapping the hand. "You are not going to say it does not hurt?" she asked. She had heard humans boast about pain before. She had heard most species say things to seem strong. He looked up at her with the gray eyes that gave nothing away. "Of course it hurts," he said. "That's not really the point though, is it?" She did not have an answer for that. She stood there for a moment longer, watching him finish the wrapping. He was neat about it. Efficient. Like someone who had done this before. More than once. Maybe many times. She left without saying anything else. She walked back through the corridor, past the chamber where the broken session was being quietly cleared, past the guards, past the banners of 100 civilizations. She walked to her private quarters and stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Her handmaiden, a small, quiet woman named Sarah, came to check on her. "Are you well, Your Highness?" "Yes," Velshara said. "Then, find out everything about that human, the delegate. His history, his record, his background, all of it." Sarah paused. "The human? The Tier F delegate?" "Yes." Velshara's voice was not angry and not soft. It was the voice she used when something had earned her full attention. "Everything." Sarah bowed and left. Velshara stood alone in the quiet room. She thought about the 2 broken fingers, the calm voice, the way he had moved, not like a hero, not like someone performing bravery, like someone who had simply decided what needed to be done and done it, the way you do something you have done 100 times before. That's not really the point though, is it? She could not stop hearing it. Sarah was fast. She was good at finding things. It was why she had been placed with the princess in the first place. She had contacts across the station, access to certain databases, and a very quiet way of asking questions without making people feel they were being asked. By the time the station's second-day cycle began, she had put everything she found into a single file and brought it to Velshara. Velshara read for a long time. At first, she was reading about Ethan, his service record, his years in humanity's colonial frontier wars. The names of the places he had been sent, most of them she did not recognize, because they were small, far out, unimportant places that no major civilization had bothered to map properly. The record described what had happened in those places in short, flat language. The kind of language soldiers use when they write about things that do not fit in ordinary sentences. There were awards listed, a few citations, also injuries, more injuries than most people survive, all treated, all recovered from. He had been 22 when he started, and 31 when he left the military. He had taken a position in the diplomatic corps almost immediately after. His supervisor's notes described him as calm under pressure and effective in hostile environments. There was a smaller note at the bottom that said, "Recommend for sensitive postings. Does not panic." She had reached the end of his personal file and started to turn the page when she stopped. Sarah had attached something else. A second file. Longer. It was not about Ethan. It was about humanity. Velshara almost set it aside. She had grown up knowing the standard data on humans. Tier F. New to space. Underdeveloped. Their planet was average in size. Their biology was soft and fragile. No special senses. No natural armor. No venom. No significant physical advantages over most species. Their lifespan was short. Their technology, when they first arrived in space, had been generations behind the conclave average. She had learned all of that. She had filed it away under not interesting. But she read the second file. It started with history, pre-space history, humanity's own past, on their own single planet, before they had ever looked up and understood what the stars were. They had fought. That part she expected. Most species had violent histories. What she had not expected was the scale of it, or the relentlessness. Humans had fought each other without stopping for thousands of years. Not small conflicts, not territorial disputes resolved in a season. Massive, total wars that covered entire continents, that used weapons designed specifically to kill as many of their own kind as possible. Chemicals released into the air to burn lungs. Devices built to flatten whole cities in a single moment. They had done these things to each other. And then, they had stopped, rebuilt, and kept going. There had been diseases that killed hundreds of millions. They had survived. There had been changes in their planet's climate that should have collapsed their food supply. They had adapted. There had been disasters, famines, collapses of entire civilizations. Each time, somewhere, some group of humans had kept going and rebuilt from whatever was left. She turned another page. There was a section that a conclave historian had written, a short analysis of human biology in context. It noted that humans had one of the highest pain tolerances of any known biological species. Not because their nerves were less sensitive, they were actually quite sensitive, but because of the way their minds were built. They could be in significant pain and continue functioning, continue thinking, continue deciding. Most species, when pushed past a certain physical threshold, would stop and deal with the pain first. Humans would file it away, somewhere, like a note left for later, and keep moving. There was a note at the bottom of the section that Sarah had highlighted. Of particular interest is the following. The human subject described above, tolerance, adaptability, prolonged function, under physical and psychological duress, is not considered exceptional within their species. These traits appear broadly across the population. What other civilizations might identify as heroic behavior appears to be standard operating function for a significant portion of adult humans. Velshera sat back. She read the line again. Not exceptional within their species. Standard. She thought about Ethan in the negotiation chamber. Moving before anyone else. Taking 2 hits, and using both of them. The broken fingers wrapped alone in a medical bay without complaint. The voice that said, "Of course it hurts," and immediately moved past it. That was the average. She stood up and went to find her father. Cale was in the flagship's lower hall, reviewing his own reports from the incident. He looked up when she entered. He did not say anything. He simply waited. He had always done that, given her space to speak instead of pushing. It was the thing she had always respected most about him, even when he was difficult in other ways. She put the file on the table in front of him and said, "Father, that human isn't ordinary." He looked at the file, then at her. "Explain," she told him. She told him about the reaction in the hall on the first day, the pressure signal the Dravathi emitted, the signal every species felt, and the one human who hadn't shifted back an inch. She told him about the negotiation chamber, the way Ethan had moved, the 2-second gap between when he had acted and when the Dravathi guards had followed. She told him about the broken fingers, and the quiet voice, and the line that had not left her mind. Then she pushed the file closer and said, "Read the second part. Not about him. About humans." Cale picked up the file. He read the way he did everything without rushing, without showing what he thought. She stood and waited. When he put the file down, his face had changed. Not dramatically. Cale never changed dramatically. But there was something behind his eyes that had shifted. A small, careful recalculation. "You're saying he is not a special case," Cale said. "I'm saying he may be completely normal," Velshera said. Silence. The sparring event had been arranged 2 days earlier by Lord Veth. It was meant to be entertainment, a public demonstration of Dravathi physical superiority against a lesser species. Humans had, apparently, something called hand-to-hand combat tradition, and Veth had thought it would be amusing to invite the human delegation to participate. He had selected a champion from the household guard, a warrior named Brath, who was large even by Dravathi standards and had not lost a sanctioned match in 11 years. The event was held in the station's open gymnasium. Several delegations had gathered to watch. Ethan had agreed to the match with no visible hesitation, which had amused Veth greatly. The first exchange lasted about 9 seconds. Brath moved. Ethan tried to redirect, misjudged the speed and the weight behind it, and went down hard. He got back up. A low sound of amusement moved through the watching crowd. The second exchange lasted longer. Brath was clearly not at full effort. He was playing. He landed 3 strikes that each would have put most opponents on the ground and kept them there. Ethan went down again on the third. He got back up again. Slower this time. Breathing harder. Veth was laughing openly. Velshera was watching very carefully. She had noticed something. Ethan was not trying to match Brath in the second exchange. He was not trying to win. He was watching. Even when the strikes landed, even going down, his eyes were open and tracking. He was learning something. She was not sure what yet. The third exchange began. Everything changed. Ethan moved differently. He had adjusted his angle of approach. Small difference. But it took him outside Brath's dominant striking line. Brath threw the first blow. Ethan was not where it expected him to be. The second blow, he didn't block it. He stepped into it at an angle, so the force traveled across his shoulder instead of into it, and his own movement was already continuing into Brath's balance point. Brath shifted to compensate. Ethan had anticipated the shift. His next two movements were already timed to it. It was not a victory of strength. Not even close. Brath was still landing hits, but each exchange was shorter. Each time, Ethan knew one more thing than before. The match ended with both of them standing. Ethan was bleeding from a split above his eye. He was breathing in short, controlled pulls. But he was standing. The gymnasium had gone very quiet. Brath looked at the human across the space between them with an expression that was not quite what it had been at the start. It was something more careful, more serious. Velshera turned her head and found her father standing nearby. She had not heard him arrive. He was watching Ethan, who had accepted a cloth from a human aide and was pressing it to the cut above his eye, with the same neat efficiency he applied to everything. Kale was quiet for a moment. Then he said not to anyone in particular, just to the air in front of him. Invite him to dinner. Velshara looked at her father. He had never said those words about a Tier F delegate in his life. She understood that something had changed, not loudly, not with any announcement, but something had shifted in the room, in her father's face, in the space between two species that were supposed to have nothing to say to each other. She looked back at Ethan, pressing cloth to his face, standing steady. She still did not have a name for what she felt when she looked at him. But it was not nothing. The dinner invitation arrived through the official channel, which made it formal. It was stamped with the Emperor's personal seal, which made it significant. When Ethan read it, he set it down on his desk, looked at it for a moment, and then picked it up and read it again. His colleague Soren, sitting across the room, watched his face for a reaction and found none. "That's the Emperor's seal," Soren said. "He said it the way you say something when you want someone to understand how unusual it is." "I know," Ethan said. "They don't invite Tier F delegates to dinner. They don't invite Tier C delegates to dinner. I'm not sure they've ever done this." "Probably not," Ethan agreed. He set the invitation down and went back to the report he had been writing. "Tell the station kitchen I'll need something to eat before I go. I'm not going to a Dravathi dinner expecting to eat their food." Soren stared at him. Then he went to tell the kitchen. The Emperor's private dining hall aboard the Dravathi flagship was designed to make guests feel small. Everything in it was slightly too large for a non-Dravathi person. The table was a deep, dark material that looked like stone but was not. The chairs were high-backed and wide. The lighting came from above in a way that put the Emperor's seat in shadow and the guest seat in full light, which meant Kale could watch without being watched in return. It was a very old arrangement. Kale had used it many times. Ethan sat down in the guest chair, looked up at the light, and shifted his seat 2 inches to the left, which put him in the edge of the shadow line. It was a small thing. Kale noticed it. Velshara sat to her father's right. She had been invited, as was custom, as a witness and second voice. She held her cup and said nothing, and watched. The first part of the dinner was food and silence. The food was Dravathi rich, heavy, with flavors that most other species found overwhelming. Ethan ate a small portion of something, and then set his utensil down politely, and did not push for more, which was the correct social signal. He had done his research. Kale spoke first. "You handled yourself well in the chamber yesterday," he said. The words were straightforward, but the tone was not entirely a compliment. It was the beginning of a test. "I was closest to the angle of approach," Ethan said. "Anyone in that position would have moved. My guards were also in that position," Kale said. "They moved too," Ethan said. "I was just slightly ahead of them." Kale looked at him for a moment. "Slightly. 2 seconds, maybe. It's not a significant difference." It was a significant difference, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Velshara watched her father absorb the answer. She could see him adjusting. Most species, when given a compliment by the Emperor, either swelled with pride or deflected with excessive humility. Both reactions told him something useful about them. Ethan had done neither. He had given a precise, neutral assessment and declined to make it about himself. The test continued. Kale asked about humanity's position in the conclave, about their expansion plans, about what they wanted from the organization long-term. Ethan answered all of it without any hesitation, but also without any attempt to impress. He spoke about humanity the way someone speaks about a project they know well with specific detail, without pretending the problems were smaller than they were, and without apologizing for the ambitions. Then Kale leaned forward slightly and asked the question that sat under all the others. What do humans fear? The dining hall was very quiet. Ethan was still for a moment. Not uncomfortable thinking. She could tell the difference by now. He was genuinely considering the question, rather than reaching for a prepared answer. Irrelevance, he said. Dying without having mattered. Doing all of it, the building, the working, the fighting, the losing. All of it, and having it mean nothing in the end. I think that's the thing that keeps humans moving more than anything else. He paused. We're not always good at agreeing on what matters. But we're very committed to the idea that something should. Kale's eyes had not moved from him. And death itself? The Emperor asked. His voice was quieter, more direct. This was the real question. We've been dying since before we had words for it, Ethan said. We have ceremonies for it, and art about it, and philosophy built around it. We've had more practice thinking about death than almost anything else. He set his cup down. But I don't think we've ever really made our peace with it. We just decided it wasn't a reason to stop. Silence. Velshara realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly. Kale sat back in his chair. He looked at Ethan the way she had seen him look at very few things in her life. The way he looked at something that had earned his full and honest attention. The dinner continued. It did not feel like a test anymore. Later that night, Ethan could not sleep. This was not unusual. He often could not sleep when something was pulling at the back of his mind. He lay in his bunk for about an hour, and then gave up, dressed, and walked the station's empty corridors. The thing pulling at his mind was the assassination. He had been thinking about it since the day it happened. Not about the event itself, but about the details around it. Who the shooter was, how they had gotten in, who had arranged their access. The station's security team had identified the shooter as a hired operative with no clear allegiances, a professional. Someone had paid for that specific attack, in that specific room, during that specific session. And the session, Ethan had noticed, had been one of only 3 scheduled that week, where both Emperor Kael and the senior delegate of the Varrock Union, a rival empire, would be in the same room. He had been building the picture in pieces. Now, at 3 in the morning by station time, walking the empty corridor near the administrative level, he decided it was time to look for the frame. The Conclave archive room was not supposed to be accessible to Tier F delegates. It held sensitive diplomatic records, old agreements, communication logs. It required a level 3 clearance. Ethan did not have a level 3 clearance. He had, however, spent a part of his previous 2 days paying very careful attention to how certain staff members used their access cards, and he had a good memory. The door opened. He went in. The archive was quiet and cool and full of soft light from dozens of display panels. He moved to the records console and began working. He was focused enough that he did not hear the door open again about 20 minutes later. You are not supposed to be here. He turned around. Velshara stood in the doorway. She was in simpler clothing than usual, not robes, just a long dark jacket, no guards. Her amber eyes moved from him to the display console and back. He held very still for a moment. No, he said. I'm not. What are you looking for? He considered not telling her. He looked at her face, sharp, controlled, not alarmed. Not reaching for a communication device. Waiting. He turned back to the display and expanded the network he had built. It filled the panel in front of them, a web of connections between communication records, access logs, financial transfers, scheduling changes, all linked and color-coded. Someone hired the shooter, he said. But the target wasn't only your father. The timing was chosen specifically so that your father would look like the likely aggressor to the Varrock delegation. If Kael had been killed, the evidence trail would have pointed back to the Varrock. If the Varrock delegate had been killed, which almost happened when the shot went wide, the evidence would have pointed to the Dravathi. He traced a line on the panel with one finger. Either way, a war starts. And this group, he pointed to a cluster of names. benefits from that war considerably. Velshara stepped closer and looked at the panel. She was quiet for a long time. This would take months to arrange. She said, "At least. Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice was very direct. No performance in it. Humanity has nothing to gain from Dravathi-Varric politics. You are Tier F. This is not your war. He looked at her. Your people, he said. Simply. The way you say something that is so obvious to you that it barely needs saying. That's enough. She stared at him. That feeling was back, the cold, rapid thing in her chest that she had first felt in the medical bay. Bigger, now. Clearer. She was beginning to understand what it was, and that understanding was uncomfortable in a way she did not entirely know how to hold. She looked back at the display panel. My father needs to see this, she said. I know, Ethan said. I was going to bring it to him in the morning. I wanted to make sure the picture was complete first. She nodded, slowly. Then she pulled up a chair and sat down. Show me what you have, she said. All of it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled up the first file and started at the beginning. They worked through the rest of the night together. Neither of them mentioned this, afterward, as something unusual. But neither of them forgot it either. Morning came to the station in the form of a cycle change. The lights shifted from dim blue to full white. The air systems adjusted, and the corridors that had been empty filled again with movement. Species from 100 worlds going to 100 different sessions, all of them believing the day would be like any other. Ethan and Velshara had been awake for most of the night. By the time the station shifted to morning cycle, the display panel in the archive room showed a complete picture. Every connection mapped. Every name identified. The web of the conspiracy stretched across 4 civilizations and involved money, old grudges, trade agreements used as cover, and a single coordinated plan. Manufacture a war between the Dravathi Empire and the Varric Union. Let the 2 largest military powers in the conclave tear each other apart. Step into the vacuum. The architects were a group that had no official name. They moved through shell organizations and hired hands. Their leaders held respectable positions on the conclave floor. Velshara had looked at the finished picture and said nothing for a long time. Then she had gone to wake her father. Ethan had gone back to his room, changed his shirt, and had the meal he hadn't eaten the night before. He sat at his small desk and read through everything one more time, checking for gaps. There were none he could find. By mid-morning, Emperor Kale had seen the evidence. He had reviewed it without any visible emotion. He had asked 6 precise questions, all of them good questions, and Ethan had answered each one. When the last answer was given, Kale had sat very still and then said, I need to verify the communication logs independently. Ethan had said that was exactly the right thing to do. They had arranged for a secure transfer of the data to the Dravathi-owned intelligence team. All of that had been done carefully, quietly, and correctly. What none of them had expected was the speed. The conspirators had their own people inside the station. That was not surprising. A plan this large needed eyes everywhere. One of those eyes had noticed unusual activity near the archive room during the night cycle. By mid-morning, a message had been passed. By the time the Grand Conclave session opened at noon, all delegations present, as required for the formal treaty review, scheduled for that day, the conspirators had made a decision. They triggered their contingency. The Grand Conclave chamber was the largest room on the station. High ceiling, circular floor, seats arranged in tiered rings so that every delegation could see every other. It was designed for transparency. No secrets in this room. Everything spoken here was heard by everyone. The session had been open for perhaps 12 minutes, when a delegate from the Orath Collective, a mid-tier civilization that had always seemed harmless, rose and asked the floor for an emergency point of order. The session chair allowed it. The delegate walked to the central floor and presented a recording. It was a communication log, audio and visual. It showed a figure in Dravathi military dress at a private console, speaking in clipped, direct words. The words were an assassination order. The target was the Varric senior delegate. The date and timestamp placed the communication 3 days before the attempt in the negotiation chamber. The quality was very good. The voice matched known recordings. The face was blurred plausibly, the delegate explained, due to encryption degradation, but the uniform, the setting, the language, the seal visible on the console behind the speaker, all Dravathi. The chamber reacted. Not with shouting. With that particular silence that is louder than shouting, the silence of dozens of delegations all reaching the same understanding at the same moment. The Verak delegates were already rising from their seats. The Dravathi guards had their hands near their weapons. 2 other delegations had begun moving toward the exits. Velshara, seated behind her father, felt the room shift like a ship losing its balance. She looked at the display being projected above the central floor, the fabricated recording, playing on a loop, and she thought, we have 40 seconds, maybe less, before this room becomes a war. She looked at her father. KL was on his feet, his face controlled, preparing to speak. And then someone else was already walking to the center of the floor. Ethan Voss crossed from the human delegation section to the open central space, with the same pace he used to cross any other room, steady, unhurried, as if he were moving between one task and the next. He had a data tablet under his arm. He had no authority to stand on that floor. He was Tier F. There were rules about which delegations could address the open session, and when, and humanity met none of the criteria. He stood in the center of the floor. The session chair started to object. Ethan spoke first. The recording is fabricated, he said. His voice carried. He was not shouting. The room's acoustics were good, and he knew it, and he used it. I can show you why. The room did not go quiet. It was already loud, rising. But something, the certainty in the voice, maybe, or the plainness of it, the complete absence of performance made enough heads turn that the volume did not increase further. The session chair said, "Delegate, you do not have the floor." "I'll have it briefly," Ethan said, still calm. 40 seconds. If I'm wrong, remove me. He held up the tablet. He had already connected it to the chamber's display system. He had done it the moment he walked onto the floor, quietly. With the practiced ease of someone who had checked the connection port type 2 days ago and remembered it, the display above the central floor changed. The fabricated recording shrank to one side. Next to it, a series of data points appeared. "This recording shows a communication made on the 14th, he said. "The timestamp is authentic. The location coding is authentic. The problem is the signal variance." He pointed to a small graph in the corner of the display. Every Dravathi military console produces a specific background frequency when in use. It's not secret. It's in the Conclave's technical registry. The frequency in this recording does not match any active Dravathi console on record during the 14-day period it claims to be from. It matches, instead, a signal generator sold commercially through 2 companies, both of which are owned by organizations connected to the group I have been investigating since the day after the assassination attempt. He expanded the display. The web of the conspiracy was now visible to the entire chamber. "This group arranged the assassination attempt," he said. "They designed it to implicate either the Dravathi or the Verak, depending on which target was successfully hit. The attempt failed. This recording is the backup plan. I have independent verification of the signal data from 3 Conclave technical staff members who agreed to check it this morning." He paused. "If the session chair would like, I can provide the verification codes now." The room was completely still. Ethan stood in the center of it, a small figure in a plain uniform, with a data tablet and 2 broken fingers wrapped in medical strips, surrounded by the representatives of civilizations that between them controlled thousands of ships and hundreds of worlds. He waited. The session chair, a very old and experienced member of the Keth Empire, took a long breath. Then she said, "Provide the verification codes." He provided them. What followed was not fast or clean. It was loud and argued and messy in the way that important things in large rooms almost always are. The Orath delegate tried to object and was interrupted. The Verak senior delegate asked for the data to be sent directly to their own analysts. The chair called for 3 separate verification procedures to run simultaneously. 2 of the conspiracy's members tried to leave the chamber and were stopped at the doors by Conclave security. Ethan had submitted the names to security an hour before the session began, with a request to watch for departures. He had thought of that too. By the time the session was officially suspended for independent verification, which would be completed by evening, and would confirm everything the war had not started. It was an hour after the session ended, when Emperor Kale found Ethan in a side corridor near the chamber. Not a formal meeting. The Emperor had simply walked in the direction he had seen the human go. Ethan stopped when Kale appeared. He stood straight, hands at his sides, and waited. Kale was quiet for a moment, just looking, taking the measure of something he had already measured once, and was now measuring again. "You had nothing to gain from this," Kale said. "Sure I did," Ethan said. "A galaxy not on fire. Humanity has to live here too." Kale looked at him for a long time. Then he did something that made Velshara, who had followed her father, and stood now at the corridor's edge, stop breathing completely. Emperor Dravath Kale, ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the known galaxy, a man who had accepted formal tribute from 100 civilizations in his lifetime, inclined his head. Not deeply. Not with ceremony. Just a slow, deliberate forward motion of the head that said, clearly and unmistakably, "I see you." Ethan returned the gesture without any sign of being overwhelmed by it. They parted ways without further conversation. Velshara stood in the corridor after her father had walked past her, and she stayed there for a while. She thought about the first moment she had seen Ethan standing still in the entrance hall, reading his tablet, while the pressure of the Dravathi arrival moved every other creature in the room back an inch without them knowing why. She thought about the negotiation chamber, the broken fingers, the dinner, the archive room, the central floor of the Grand Conclave, with a plain data tablet, and 40 seconds, and a voice that did not shake. She had stood before dangerous things in her life. She had stood before her father in his anger, which was like standing near a storm. She had stood before the cold weight of open space. She had stood before species whose bodies made fear without even trying. She had not expected to feel something like trembling, quiet, deep, the kind that lives in the chest and not the hands, before a man with a wrapped hand and a prepared argument who said, "Your people." That's enough, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. It was not fear. She was certain of that now. It was something closer to awe, the kind you feel when you realize that you have been looking at something for days without understanding what it was, and then suddenly you do. She understood now. He had never been performing. There had been no mask, no strategy behind the calm. That steadiness, the broken fingers filed away for later, the 2-second gap, the night in the archive, the 40 seconds on the open floor, that was simply what he was. Not heroism, not exceptional courage. Just a human, doing what humans apparently did. She thought about the file. Not exceptional within their species. She thought about a whole civilization of them. And for the first time since arriving at the conclave, Princess Velshara of the Dravathi Empire understood something that the galaxy's species registries had not thought to put in their notes on humanity. It was not the ones who were loud you had to watch for. It was the quiet ones who kept getting up. The universe had seen conquerors and prophets, and things that called themselves gods. It had not yet learned to be careful of the prepared, stubborn, quietly relentless average man. It was beginning to learn.